We are picking up after a wonderful presentation by Kyle, so thank you again. We had some great words of praise in the chat and here in the room, so yeah, we've already learned a lot today and we're about to learn a bunch more. So before we get into it, I'll just reintroduce myself. My name is Donnell Gasparini. I am on the Science Communication and Outreach Working Group for SEMRIG, which is the Canadian Eastern Massasauga CEM Rattlesnake Recovery Implementation and Group. So I was not lying earlier when I called it a mouthful. Like, yeah, I have to retrain myself every time I go to say it. So I'm 1 for 2 right now. I got it earlier, but not right now. So I will be here trying to keep things flowing. Thank you for those of you who put questions in when you filled out the RSVP form. So we've got those on hand, but we're really encouraging anyone, if you do have a question, to please raise your hand, whether you're in the room or raising a virtual hand online. Those of you online are welcome to unmute yourselves once you've got your hand up and you're invited to do so. And yeah, please relay your question orally, verbally. And if you would prefer, you're welcome to put it in the chat as well. And Katie is still here on tech duty. So she'll be keeping an eye on the chat for any questions or for any sort of alerts about problems that people may be encountering online. So with that, just a reminder that we're trying to keep the questions today really focused on science communication as it relates to the Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake. And some and maybe even a lot of what we cover will be applicable to other species that face similar threats and have yeah, sort of similar challenges that they're facing in their wild habitats. So definitely try to think about what you're learning today and apply it elsewhere as broadly as you can, so that we can all kind of, yeah, make the most of this information. So, okay, we've met Kyle already. I feel like I know you, even though that was a very, you know, I don't, yeah, but that was great. That's the feeling you probably wanted me to walk away with. And then we've got Jenny Pearson here in person as well. So Jenny began Scienceational Snakes in 1994. Working with reptiles has been her lifelong dream, and she is very privileged to work with such a fantastic team of people and animals every day. Now, Jenny, I don't know if you wanted to add more to that, to speak to your experiences or sort of what does it mean to operate Scienceational Snakes? What is the type of work that you're doing on a regular basis?
Well, the byline or our motto for Scienceational Snakes is conservation through education. And through when I started, we had a rehab license, and you know, to work with the turtles and stuff and the snakes. But getting out there and talking to people and finding out what was going on, I thought, what we really need to do, instead of treating them when they come in, let's stop them from coming in to the rehab centers. And it'd be quite easy if we could, you know, just get people to move turtles instead of running them over, not take a shovel out to their garden when they see a snake in their backyard, or have the cottagers, you know, getting rid of the rattlesnakes and moving them 10 kilometers down the road. So that's been the goal. Conservation through education is our byline. And that's what I've been doing for, had to mention, 30 years.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, to bring that wealth of knowledge here, that's going to be amazing to dig deeper into. And then in addition to Kyle and Jenny, we have 2 panelists who are joining us online, and they're sitting in the figurative seats over there on the laptop. But for those of us at the front, we can see them on the back screen there. So we've got Meghan Mitchell, who is a lead staff scientist at Science North in Sudbury, Ontario. And Meghan leads the animal care and welfare of both the vertebrate and invertebrate live animal ambassadors. As a zoologist, she has a passion for all living things and has worked most extensively with reptiles, amphibians, and fish, both native and exotic. She loves the world of science communication and gets to share conservation messaging with thousands of guests that visit the Science Center. She is also a beekeeper and loves watching bumblebees in her garden at home. So Meghan, is there anything you would like to tell us, maybe a bit more about your background and what it is that science communication looks like to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've been here at Science North for about 12 years now. And I'll be honest in that I sort of began my journey in science communication without realizing sort of that's what I was doing when I was going through university. Where I'm from in Cochrane, Ontario, is where when I was going through university the last summer that I was there, the polar bear habitat that is there opened up, and I began working there and doing science communication without sort of realizing. And by the time that I graduated university, I kind of knew research wasn't the thing I wanted to do. I wanted an excuse to talk to people about animals and share my passion for them, and of course, conservation. So that's kind of how I began that on that journey. And then found myself here at Science North, where I've been for the past 12 years, as I mentioned. And really at Science North, we've had animals since the beginning. So we opened in 1984, and the main purpose is to connect people with the animals in their own backyards. And part of that is doing animal demonstrations, meeting animals with our visitors, school programs that engage people with our animal ambassadors as well. So all of these things sort of combined, specifically today, is one of the things I wanted to highlight was the rattlesnake demonstration that we do, which is how I was very fortunate to be connected with you all. So by you guys coming and meeting our rattlesnake. I can kind of go into a little bit more about the demonstration, but if you want me to stop there, I can do a little bit more later too. I'm not sure.
Okay, yeah, no, that's totally fair. Maybe we'll stop there. And I feel like maybe part of the discussion today will be about, we'll include the use of ambassador animals and how to connect with and without. So yeah, we can touch on that then. But thank you very much. And last but certainly not least, David Pearson is our final panelist for the day. David is an Emeritus Professor at the University of Natural Sciences, in the School of Natural Sciences at Laurentian University in Sudbury as well. He was on leave for 6 years as the project director of Science North, the Science Center in Sudbury, which is where Meghan is joining us from. David has retired from teaching geology, science communication, and climate change, but still works as a member of Up North on Climate, a 4-person not-for-profit team at the university collaborating with 5 Northern Ontario First Nation councils and Grand Council Treaty Number 3 in developing resources and building capacity for community-based, Indigenous-led climate change adaptation. The collaboration is now a partnership of convenience, Partners for Indigenous Climate Change Adaptation. And we've got a web link that maybe we can pop into the chat so that everybody can check that out if they're interested. But David, would you like to share some more about your background and yeah, your science communication approaches?
Sure, thanks very much. And congratulations, Kyle, on a wonderful overview of science communication. As you just heard, it's been part of what I've taught since I came to Laurentian as a geologist over 50 years ago, before some of you indeed were born. I was teaching first-year geology in Sudbury, but I had the opportunity to develop a remote online continuing education course in the 1970s called Understanding the Earth, which you can still find on YouTube, and my beard is much blacker than in those videos than it is now. And that led me by chance to be given the opportunity to be the project director for Science North, and to have, in fact, a rattlesnake from on loan from the Toronto Zoo as one of the first visitors, the first guests from the animal world, who met many visitors, and I'll be able to speak a little bit about the way that we set that up with Franco Mariotti, who was one of Meghan's predecessors in the Science Center. But I also want to, when we come to be answering questions, to recognize that one of the slides that Kyle showed was of Michael Faraday speaking in the Royal Institution in London. I'm not sure whether he realized that, but that was that black and white sketch. In fact, part of Science North, where the rattlesnake demonstrations took place when we opened in 1984, was in a replica, if you like, of the Royal Institution with Faraday and his communication capacity in mind. We call it the Discovery Theatre. And that's part of where Meghan works every day and where the rattlesnakes met the public. So thanks, Kyle, for putting that up. But also, I want, as I mentioned, when we come to be answering questions, to just speak a little bit about framing, which I think actually relates also to Priyank Shah's question and comment about his experience from India. So I'll pass the mic back to you, Hannah, and we'll carry on, and I'll talk about framing when we get there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And big thank you to all 4 of our panelists for coming here and being willing to share what they've learned over the many years that they've been involved.
Can I just make a quick correction? Anyway, thank you. I invited you, and there are 2 Hannahs in the room. But Danelle is the one that you can see at the table. I'm here too.
Okay. We both got the brown hair, we're pretty fair skinned. I can totally see how, yeah. Okay, so with that, I guess we will jump right in. So Priyank, I don't know if you want to unmute and maybe just a condensed version of your question, just to reiterate very succinctly what it is at the core of the question that you're looking to have answered.
That how do we communicate and make people realize not the importance, but make them cohabit with a snake if they are they are ready to cohabit with a larger predator. So if people are already cohabiting with the black bear, then just what's the missing part? Where's the hindrance of people that they are not able to cohabit with a snake, venomous snake? Like, how do we communicate that?
Okay, thank you.
I think his question is, what's wrong with Canadians?
That's a difficult question, but a very valid.
Would anyone like to have the first go at this? We can, multiple panelists are welcome to contribute to each question. So if anyone would like to start us off, please go ahead.
I think David has some framing that he would like to bring.
All right, David, it's over to you.
Sure. Thanks very much. I think there's a cultural aspect to this, and it goes back to my childhood when I visited church every Sunday. I visited the church not so much for what happened inside the church itself, but I just loved the sandwiches that were served in the community hall afterwards. But part of what I remember from those sermons and reacted against even when I was a kid was this piece from Genesis, which, having heard Kyle's comments about framing, I want to read to you. And it's from Genesis verse 27 of Genesis 1, the King James version of the Bible. And it says, "Be fruitful and multiply," and that's of course us, "and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing upon moving upon the earth." And I think that cultural context, that religious context of having dominion over the earth, is part of the roots of the attitudes that are reflected towards wildlife and the natural world by those of us who came as settlers to Turtle Island. The culture of First Nations is very different. First Nations see life, including snakes and including bears and including insects and every living thing and all of the trees and so forth that I see out of my window here, as part of a circle of life. And we're just as much part of that family and that circle of life as every other creature. We don't have dominion over the other creatures or the other life on the earth if your cultural background is an indigenous background. And that's part of what I've learned as I've worked for the last 15 years with First Nations in the north of Ontario. The attitude towards what you and I, or what settlers, I guess I should say, would regard as dangerous, like polar bears, for example. Polar bears wander through communities, and they don't get shot. They're respected. They're respected as another member of the family of life. And if indeed someone does become hurt by one, or is in danger, then there's a reaction. But there's not a reaction in the same way as those of us with the cultural background of settlers from the sort of upbringing that I had. And that was part of the attitude of my parents and my grandparents and my great-grandparents. And I think a lot of the emotional, and maybe they're partly responsible for the phobias that Kyle spoke about, come from that kind of cultural framing that is so different if you move to look at the attitudes of the First Nations of Turtle Island. I think that's something that really needs to be taken into account.
Thank you very much. Would anyone like to add to that?
One of the thoughts that I had in hearing that question too is that I think it comes down to the fact that rattlesnakes especially are not necessarily, they're not found everywhere in Ontario. And as their ranges have changed and shifted and expanded, people are becoming more and more aware of their presence. And so part of the goal when we do our demonstration is giving people the confidence in how to identify them and how to stay safe. Because just like bears, you learn at a young age, if you have bears near you, how to stay safe, right? And as soon as you sort of have that knowledge and are comfortable with that knowledge, that's part of it, right? How to avoid, what the things to look for, and also like how to look at a snake and then know what species it is so that you can sort of behave appropriately and not just immediately get scared out of the get-go. So that's a big, we spend probably about 2/3 of the whole 30-minute presentation when we do a rattlesnake demonstration on those two things: how to ID the snake and then how to stay safe in their environment. And I think that's a big part of it. It's just like learning and having the confidence to sort of like move about the world.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what you said relates to what Kyla talked about having control. And so like if you understand what you're seeing and if you understand what you can do to stay safe yourself and keep your children safe and your pets, like that gives you the control and the understanding that those actions actually are a lot less taxing than going out of your way to do something that you might have initially believed to have been the best course of action.
Can I just come in there again with a quite different point, but that relates to what we've just heard? When we began in 1984 with the very first snake demonstrations in that Discovery Theatre, Franco Mariotti was the biologist who presented it, and presented the rattlesnake show in there, and he began and asked people, "What do you think is the most dangerous creature in your life?" And people, sometimes there were answers, sometimes there weren't. And then he put up a picture of a golden retriever. And the fact is that dogs kill more people in a year than snakes do. And in fact, the last death that we know of from a rattlesnake bite was 70 years ago. 70 years. And in that time, probably dozens, and maybe even more than 100 young kids have been killed by dogs, man's best friend, not by snakes. People people like furry animals. They like those that they're familiar with, and they really don't see the relevant dangers. And I think that that was a beautiful way to start that that show that Franco developed. Just make people look inside their own beliefs and their own perceptions, and realize that they've got a twisted view of what's dangerous in the world.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think even for those of us in the room today, that's so powerful hearing it, you know, to an audience that probably already considers themselves to think more openly about creatures like snakes.
When we have them on display, and people will come up and, is that dangerous? And I often, not as bad as a dog. And then they look very confused. I'm like, no, that's a rattlesnake compared to a dog. Oh, this thing's a dream, much safer. But yeah, it's getting them out of their main thought. Oh, I have to think about this, and giving them a different approach.
Yeah, different approach, maybe creating a new shortcut for people to go to.
When we have snakes out, people will be, does it bite? Which is always it. And the answer is yes. And it's funny because I actually had a national park employee, and she had taken one of our fox snakes to the sportsman show. And she's like, the kids are all coming by, they're having all these school groups, and they're like, does it bite? And she says, I'm like, no. And then they take off. And I was like, because you're giving them the wrong answer. They're asking that, but they know it's not going to bite them because they can see that. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. Does it bite? And I said, say yes, because then they stop and they're, what? It bites. Yeah, how do you eat? Do you stuff your food up your nose? That's disgusting and you should stop. And we'd never get a mouse up the nose of this snake. So of course they have to bite their food, but you're not their food. And then you've caught their attention, you've got them thinking, because it's not just the knee-jerk reaction that, well, they know it's not going to bite them because, I mean, they're going to get sued, and everybody knows that. All like kids in grade 2 are like, I'll sue you. So everybody knows that the answer is going to be, no, it's not going to bite you. But so give them the actual true answer that shocks them.
And I'm going to try as we go today to alternate between taking responses or like questions from online audience members and those in the room. Would anyone in the room like to ask the first in-person question? Maybe I put on a little too pressure there. Yes.
So in terms of science communication, like what would you tell somebody who, like especially a cottager who I believe is probably the biggest threat to Massasaugas, what would you tell them when they say, yeah, you know, I'm removing it or killing it because I'm afraid it's going to bite my dog. We've had a dog that's gotten bit on the property, so now we don't want it to happen again. Because that's obviously something that, like, that's a real threat that could definitely happen if you're not watching your dog's not properly trained. So what do you tell them?
Yeah, I
got a story.
Yeah. I could start the ball rolling. I'm sure there'll be other answers to that, but I think there's a lot of variables in that question. It depends for me a lot how much it's asked, right? If it's I think more aggressive tone and like, yeah, I killed him because, you know, I'm keeping my dog safe and things like that.
They killed him and I jumped and said, okay, right. You know what? Just call me if one's there and I will deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between like, I killed them because my dog's here and, oh, I'm trying to move them because it's not super safe. If that sort of aggressive tone, and especially people love to tell you, they just love to tell you about the snakes they kill. Like it's almost like they take joy in it. I don't know why. So my response is I think of it in two ways. I think first I want to convey a genuine emotional response to that because people don't expect it, right? They expect you to confront them with information, tell them why they shouldn't, tell them it's illegal, whatever it is. So I want them to know it makes me really sad. Like I'm really sad to hear that. And I also want to engage them in conversation because oftentimes people will throw that out as like a passing, like they start to walk away, right? They want to come by and tell you they killed the snakes and they turn around and walk away. And so I want to, in some ways, subvert their expectation. I want to respond to them in a way that's a little bit different than what they expect so that they'll hopefully be hooked in so that we can have the next sentence, right? And we can have a bit of a conversation because it's not something you're going to address in one sentence. So if somebody says something like that, I often say, well, you know, that makes it really sad to hear that. I mean, like I really, not it's illegal, not you shouldn't do it, but it makes me really sad because I really love these snakes. That can be a way to just start the dialogue. If somebody's rude about it, which they often are, I have started that conversation by saying, that's really rude that you would say that to me, which like it depends on the level of confrontation, right? Like I'm going to meet you where you're at. And so if you come at me with, I wish a guy the other day told me, wish I had a shovel. I said, that's really rude. I don't know why you would say that to me. I think that's really rude. And he stopped in his tracks. He didn't expect that kind of honest response. So I try to respond honestly, and I try to convey my emotions about it so that they know that it's real to me. It's like a human thing to me. And I would say, like, you know, this is something I love, and you're talking about killing it, right? Like if I told you I killed your dog, like that would be really sad, right?
Right, when you're talking to somebody who's like, this is a real story as well, like someone whose dog has been a victim of that. Obviously, there's certain steps a logical person would take to avoid that happening again, but one of them's not killing a snake or removing it. But what do you tell somebody who's ignorant to that information that, you know, they're worried that their dog is going, it's not that they even hate the snake, like what, remove that, the fact they're just worried that their dog may be bit again, or may have to be hospitalized again, or someone else's dog who's visiting the cottage. Like, what do you tell somebody
once you get past
scenario?
Once you get them hooked in, and once you get past that aggressive tone, or if they come at you with a less aggressive tone and they want genuine advice,
Right.
and then you got to get in some good information. And for me, you know, I'm not an expert on the rules for moving rattlesnakes or what we advise people to do, and maybe some other folks can comment on that. But yeah, I would just try to gently direct them to a better alternative and explain why killing the snake, let's say, is not a good thing to do. It's dangerous for you.
Right.
And I try when possible, and it's a tough thing to do, but to convey some sense of the fact that this snake was there first and it deserves to be there and it has a right on its own. And, you know, I always think I have them like arrows in my quiver, right? And trying to react to what that person is saying. And like, are they going to respond well to the idea that this is a species of risk and we should be concerned about it because it's disappearing and that's why it's extra important? Or maybe they'll be more interested in the fact that it provides some rodent control for their cottage, or like, what can I sort of pull out of the quiver? What's this person connecting to? But it's tough. It's really tough because people don't want to put their freaking dog on a leash, which would solve the whole problem in the first place, or teach their kids how to interact with Massasaugas properly. But yeah, I don't know. I'll maybe open up to some others for other thoughts on that, because it's
Well, yeah, no, I knew that was coming up. So in the programs when we were doing cottage life shows and everything. So I got in touch with a vet up around Georgian Bay to say, you know, like, you're up in Georgian Bay, you must, you know, treat dogs that get snake bites, and, you know, can you train dog, like, what can you do about that? And that's like, yeah, my golden retriever has been bitten 12 times. And I was like, so they don't learn. You know, but his dog's fine. But it's been bitten 12 times by rattlesnakes. And I was like, I thought these were supposed to be trainable, smart animals. So I learned more about dogs than I did about rattlesnakes. But telling the guy that story, and I mean, the veterinarian has a dog that's been bitten 12 times. And so, I mean, your dog's going to survive, your dog's going to be fine. And you may not be if you get up close and aggressive with a dangerous animal. You know, it's not good for you, and it's not going to be good for the dog either. So it's not going to not happen if you kill one rattlesnake. You're just endangering yourself. And I mean, you try and reason and put it to them. If you have a bear, you know, if your dog attacks a bear, that could kill it. But if you see a bear on your yard, don't go up and hit it with a bat. Don't take the bear on. And it's probably the best thing to do with the rattlesnake as well. So, and, you know, trying again, some humor if they're amenable, if they're reasonable, not aggressive people. But if they are, don't bully me. Bullying is not accepted at this display.
I agree that I agree with Kyle too, and that sometimes when you are confronted with that person who is like, I've killed all of these snakes, I have 100%. So like, that makes me really sad to hear that, because like I really love these animals, and here are all the reasons why I love these animals, right? And give them like that different framing. And I think that sometimes too, people just need to know that there are people that do love and respect these animals. And to the other point, I'm not sure who made it, was like these animals were here before us, and we've moved into their territory. And also keeping in mind too that it's like, you know, when you remove a predator from an area, well, yes, the prey will go up. So, I mean, you'll have more prey, which is mice. But then another predator is just going to come in and move in as well. So it's a temporary fix. It's not permanent. And I guess for myself, I just try to like relay that information empathetically as much as possible, and then kind of take a step back and let that person digest the information, and hopefully they've come away with a different frame of mind. Because after that, you can't follow them back to their cottage to see what they're going to do, right? So, but yeah, it's being honest about how it makes you feel. I think immediately has an impact on that person, being like, oh, I thought you were going to get on board with me. Or maybe sometimes people are just cruel. I haven't decided yet.
Can I add a couple of points? I think that the story that you can tell that the vet told you about his dog having been bitten 12 times and still survives and is still running around, that's a very good story to tell somebody. And part of what my recent conversations with Franco, who I mentioned ran the first rattlesnake demos in Science North, was that he and the staff at Science North who worked with him made a special effort to speak to cottagers associations. And his impression is that, and his judgment, and there's 30 years of experience in this, is that the cottagers associations have become much more understanding and much more accepting of rattlesnakes being a natural part of the environment, the ecosystem that they've chosen to live in, that they've chosen to put their cottage in. The other thing that Franco did with those in those rattlesnake shows was to have a live rattlesnake on a table, and said to the audience, I need somebody to help me. I need a young person to come and help me, and we're going to move this rattlesnake. And Franco had a broom pole with a hook on the end that he'd made out of a coat hanger, and it was able to lift the rattlesnake. But in fact, what he did was to have the young person with his or her hand on the broom handle as well, and to put it into a garbage can, into a big garbage can, because what you can then do is move the garbage can with the snake in it to another part of your property. If you're a cottager, and put the snake into not far away, because snakes get used to the environment that they're in, and they need to hibernate, and they identify a hibernating tunnel that they can do that in near their sort of home territory. But maybe move it to somewhere that you fence off so that your dog can't get in there, so that you and your dog and the rattlesnake can continue to live together, but with some separation between the two. And even if the dog does get bitten, the dog will survive.
Thank you, everyone, for your contributions to that question. That's, yeah, definitely something that I think we've all acknowledged comes up a lot. I see a lot of nodding heads, a lot of people relating.
Sorry, we have a comment.
Okay, sure.
From Kenton, a vet in Perry Sound told me she had a 12-year-old diabetic cat survive a rattlesnake bite.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, I can up that, because a family on an island in Georgian Bay, they had an 18-year-old, not diabetic, but just 18-year-old cat on an island in Georgian Bay that came back, had been bitten in the face and envenomated. And it was all swollen up, but they're on an island in Georgian Bay. It's the middle of the night. They're like, it's so dangerous to try and get that. And it's an 18-year-old cat. So you've had a good life, everything, sorry. And 3 days later, it's fine.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of stories, that are worth telling. And you tell them right away. You deal with the perception that they're dangerous right at the front end of your discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kenton. Would anyone online, or maybe there's a question from the chat, I'm not sure, but if you have a question online, please raise your hand and we can call on you. Or Katie, has anything come in on the chat? Okay, well, maybe a question that came in ahead of time that I think is a really good one because it's something that I see a lot is, and it goes back to this idea that we heard about in Kyle's presentation about using jargon. And so a lot of the information that I hear being shared about Massasaugas or other species at risk even starts right there, species at risk, SAR. We're so used to saying it all the time, and then you dig into the different classifications, and maybe in certain parts of the range, the classification is different than in another part of that species range. How do you have any recommendations on how to talk about that element of the species without kind of getting the eyes glazing over and putting people further into it than maybe they had intended?
Species at risk is another one. I mentioned scientific names is my biggest pet peeve, but species at risk is a bit of a struggle for sure. And I'll be quick because I'm sure I'll just have good thoughts as well. But I do think you're absolutely, it's a very good point to raise that the term species at risk is challenging for folks, and the designations, which are so intuitive to us, are a problem. And what most people know is endangered species. Most people will use endangered species synonymously with species at risk. But as we know, endangered species is a specific designation of a species at risk. So I just avoid altogether for the most part, unless it's really pertinent that they know there's a legal designation. I will say Massasaugas are a disappearing species. They're a species in trouble. They're a species that's declining. Instead of using the terminology, just try to describe what is happening. And if you need to say, actually, this is what we call a threatened species, and that means this, if that's pertinent to what you're doing, then explain it. But I just start with they're disappearing. They're in big trouble. They really need our help, that kind of thing.
When you use threatened, that backfires on
They
you
think
all the
it's
time
threatening.
because they think it's threatening.
I've had that with endangered. I've had people say, you mean it's dangerous? You know,
Yeah.
endangered. Like,
Yeah.
I thought everybody
I
knew
mean,
endangered.
danger. I mean, danger. Yeah, no, in danger and threatened can really kick you in the butt.
If you need to use those terms, I think you just need to define them and provide the context. But there's lots of other ways to say a species is disappearing.
Right. Just reacting to the message that came up on the chat there about the road workers killing Massasaugas. When Highway 69 was being expanded in the neighborhood of Alban, the people in the construction actually came up to Science North for a training session in how to move Massasauga rattlesnakes. Were you there then, Megan?
They still do. Yeah. Different companies come to us for training. So
I think that part of what can be done is to make contact with the Ministry of Transport or the ministry that's responsible for the construction. Find the right audience. Kyle spoke about know your audience. Find the right audience in order to make an impact. The cottages associations are a wonderful audience, but also those who have control over the kind of training that construction workers in expanding a road would have.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think all too often we're talking back and forth to each other, but we're not the ones that we need to be sharing the information with and the strategies. And so, yeah, identifying the threat, but then going deeper and actually making that contact, even if it might feel like you're not sure what might come back because you're not familiar with that audience, but become familiar, understand where they're coming from.
Yeah. Then go to the values of the person who's in charge of the construction. Its values has a lot to do with this, which goes back to my first point about dominion over the earth. The cottagers are people who value the ecosystem that they're having their cottages in and enjoying that ecosystem. Show them a way that they can have their dogs there as well as the rattlesnakes, and I don't want to repeat the point, but tell them the stories of the survival of the dogs. I think Megan also would be able to tell you that some of the reaction from especially young visitors when the discussion with them about it takes place about snakes is theatrical. They'll all sort of go, yeah, it's an act that they put on. It's totally a theatrical act, and I think that one has to avoid overreacting to that and interpreting that as fear or phobia or whatever it is. It isn't. It's just theatrics by 10-year-old girls.
And boys. Sometimes the boys more than the girls.
Well, see, the girls are screaming and everybody knows that the girls are afraid and scared and everything, because they make a big production, because that's our society has brought us there. But you count, there's just as many boys, but they're just standing in the room going, no, man, it's okay. They're not any closer.
I'm not scared, I just don't touch something.
I did it yesterday.
Yeah, I already touched that.
Have you ever heard? Have any of you ever heard of the rattlesnake that used to come to the parking lot of the French River? No, then what is it? The French River Park? I forget. Down by French River, used to come to the parking lot every day. Franco was telling me about this up until about 2 years ago, and he's not quite sure whether it still does that. And it was able to come to the parking lot, interact with people, and nobody killed it. Nobody killed it. We shouldn't assume the worst. We shouldn't assume that everybody has got this manic idea that they should kill this dangerous animal. I think maybe sometimes we overemphasize that kill it attitude.
I always like to remind, especially if I'm doing a school program and I have a snake out, it could be any snake. And if people are having a reaction, I like to remind them, like, fear is a learned behavior often, right? And you mimic. So if one person's afraid, we want to mimic that they're afraid of, because it's like we just reiterated the dramatics of it all, right? But I usually just kind of stay like nice, calm, cool, collected, and say, okay, well, like it's here are all the reasons why it's okay. And then would you like to see one up close? Do you want me to take one out for you? You can stay back, and then as you get more comfortable, and we've been able to see, like, there's nothing that brings us the most joy, and I'm sure so many of you can relate to this, when you get somebody who comes to you who is initially very afraid, and then by the end of your maybe 30-40 minute interaction with that person, they're like, they've gained the courage to touch the snake. And it might have been like a 2-second touch, but there's nothing more rewarding to me. And it's just like reminding people of that, like this, yeah, like you may have learned to be afraid from maybe your upbringing, maybe there's a cultural aspect to this, like we started off our discussion, or maybe your grandmother or your mother or somebody in your family was afraid, right? And kind of bringing it down to that human level. And I've found that it's very powerful. Yeah.
Thank you. And Katie, I'm gonna throw it to Katie. I think we've got some comments coming in on the chat.
Yeah, so just going back to give especially those in person context from that discussion, Kathy had written in the chat, in Georgian Bay, we have heard stories of construction workers capturing and killing Massasaugas. This is a population that could use education, and these were workers specifically building cottages. And then we also have a question from Joe. So those stories about dogs surviving 12 bites, they can be useful to make a point, but they don't speak to the actual risk of your pet surviving if bitten. A story like that means nothing to me. I would want to know what the actual risk is. So what is the % likelihood of a dog surviving? So I do think it's still important to provide key facts in addition to the story. Does anyone know how lethal these bites are to dogs in general?
That's a good question. It's definitely not something I'm aware of. If anybody does know information on that, we can maybe share some. Do you have?
You can look it up.
Yeah, we can look that up. We can share it with you. Something that I can share, actually, thanks to Kenton, who reached out to the Parry Sound Hospital, answers a similar question, but in relation to humans. So the Parry Sound Hospital was able to share data about Massasauga bites that have been happening over the past 6 years. So this is combined data from all of those years. And because I know sometimes we share information about the most likely demographic of human to get bitten. and things like that. And so from the past 6 years, the average age of person that's being bitten is about 40 years of age, so a little bit older than I think most of us are used to relaying or hearing about. The range of ages has spanned from 10 years old to 68 years old. There's an average of 9 bites per year over the past 6 years. About 75%, or sorry, about 22% of these instances were when the snake was provoked. And of all of those instances of a person provoking a snake, 75% of the people provoking a snake were male. And of those examples, every single bite except for one of them was on a person's hand, which I think really points to the risk of bringing yourself in a close enough proximity for that snake to bite you. Because when looking at bites overall, well over 50%, like about 60% of them are on the foot or the ankle, as opposed to the hands, which I think you can imagine as happening much more easily based on a snake living its life on the ground, where your feet and your ankles are closer than your hands usually are. So that's some information that we can share as well, but yeah, just some interesting tidbits that was able to be shared from the Parry Sound Hospital. So thank you, Kenshin, for reaching out to them. And I'm thankful that they had all of that on hand.
Okay,
Yes,
awesome.
and the range of people who go to the Parry Sound Hospital is very considerable. There is no place in Sudbury, for example, at our hospitals where it's possible for somebody to have an anti-venom treatment. And people have about 48 hours after a bite to get for treatment. And from Sudbury or from Northern Ontario, north of us, they have to go down to Parry Sound. So Parry Sound's 9 bites is not just 9 bites in the Parry Sound area. It's 9 bites in probably 20% of Ontario that they're speaking about. And the fact that it's on their hand, and so the Parry Sound we're hearing here is typically a provincial summary. So, I mean, that's a good fact to give to people who are concerned about getting bitten. But another fact is that the fangs of a rattlesnake are very short. Very short. They're designed for killing mice, not for going through even the leather of boots. They won't get through the leather of boots. And one of the stories I've heard from one of Meghan's colleagues, and maybe Meghan, if you know it, about the guy who went out in the dark in bare feet. Why don't you tell that story?
Yeah. So because we do this rattlesnake demonstration, typically every day or on the days that Tux, who is our rattlesnake, hasn't eaten, we typically like kind of get the crowd going, and some people share their stories. And one of them was this gentleman who had seen the rattlesnakes he like throughout the day during the daytime, and after some adult beverages in the evening had decided, well, I'm gonna go and try and find the snakes again, barefoot at night with his flashlight, and I think was bitten like 12 or 16 times. It was like a ridiculous number of times. And I think he told us that it was the most expensive bite in like Ontario history or something like that. And we heard this story, I want to say maybe like within the past 4 or 5 years, or at least 6 years for sure. So that number is probably in this the statistics that and there most of the bites I think were on the lower half of his foot, because he was standing too close, and the snake got very antsy. But I think there were 2 snakes, if I remember correctly. And then similarly, a couple of summers ago, we got somebody told me that they had been bitten, and it was a young person. He was about 16 at the time, but he was bitten at 2 years old. And I think he told us a little bit about his story, where the snake was just on the step on their cottage, and he stepped down and was bitten. And I think he was very proud to tell us that he was, at least from his knowledge, the youngest person to have survived a Massasauga bite. And so, yes, we get these stories all the time, and with their permission, we like to share some of them during our demonstrations because it demonstrates to people that like the snakes don't bite unless provoked. Like you have to sort of force it a little bit, right? Like it's just its main defense mechanism. It's rattle. That's why they have it. So
Yeah, and I think it also goes to show, like, you know, there's a big range in terms of risk. And, you know, I would say at the one extreme end is death. Like, we're afraid of things that we think might kill us. But these stories really show that there's a lot of room between where we are and death. And death isn't even on the table. Like, we've heard a few examples of even small animals like the cats, things that you would expect to take a more, just sort of succumb more to some of the symptoms. And it's not to say that there is no risk, because that's just not correct information. But I think, putting it into perspective using these stories is very powerful.
I used to make fun of Chris, but I don't have his permission, but Chris' parents studied rattlesnakes. And he was in Killbear following them around with his radio tracker, and he tracked his one and went to look underneath the juniper bush to the one he tracked and set his hand on the other one that he didn't know was there. So he got bitten, and then 2 weeks later in the lab, he got bitten. So Chris' parent, the researcher, there were 6 bites that year, and he was 2 of them. So statistics can sometimes be a little misleading. Like that 12 bite guy, that's gonna throw off.
I hope that counts as one. That's a single incident. I'm sorry.
I think he was probably the person in Killbear who watched people walk along a trail very close to where he knew that there were rattlesnakes, and they walked by a couple of feet away from rattlesnakes and were not disturbed at all. They didn't even know they were there, and the rattlesnakes certainly were not looking out for people walking by and chasing them. That's just not the way that rattlesnakes behave. But the other part of Meghan's story about the fellow going out in the dark gives you an opportunity to point out one of the very fascinating characteristics or abilities of rattlesnakes, and that is their infrared their detection capacity. And part of what Franco Mariotti did in order to demonstrate the power of that in those demonstrations that I spoke about in the theater was to borrow an infrared camera from Inco, the as it was then, Valley as it is now, that they used in order to detect overheating of electrical cables. And he brought that into the Science Center and showed people what the world would look like, what that theater would look like if you were a rattlesnake in the dark and you were looking with infrared detection. I guess they're called pits, aren't they? For the in the rattlesnakes, near the rattlesnake's head. It's an absolutely fascinating and wonderful capacity for an animal to have. And that's the kind of thing that appeals to the curiosity and the interest of cottagers, for example. If you want to get cottagers to be sympathetic, empathetic to the rattlesnakes, point out how wonderfully talented they are. And that's one of the ways, their infrared detection capacity. They hunt at night. And part of what Franco also used to do, I don't think that you do it any longer, Meghan, was to have a feeding demonstration and with live mice and lab mice, not wild mice that might bring in pathogens and so forth and parasites, but with live mice. And people were absolutely fascinated. And they saw how those tiny fangs, which somebody with boots on needn't worry about, were penetrated into the mouse. And within 30 seconds, the mouse was on its back. One of the other interesting stories that he can tell, that he checked out actually with Bob Johnson of the zoo, was why was the snake not eating a live mouse, and it was in the fall. And what Bob told him was, well, probably what's happening is that the snake is feeling that it's coming into to winter, coming into late fall. But the temperature inside, because it's in the science center, doesn't match what the snake is detecting from looking through the window. And in fact, one morning, Franco came in and found a mouse was sleeping, sleeping inside the curl of the rattlesnake. It was happily sleeping there instead of being eaten by the rattlesnake. And telling those sorts of stories about the relationship between the way that a snake behaves and the environment around it adds, I think, a dimension to the wonder that one can conjure up in people. And I think that it's those sorts of little tidbits of curiosity arousing stories that make not only Meghan's visitors on the floor at Science North, but the cottagers in their cottage association meetings too, appreciate these animals as really wonderful, wonderful creatures who belong in the family of life that the First Nations celebrate. And I just want to mention in context of First Nations that one of the ideas that science in universities and, well, that scientists in our traditional academic programs need to be considering is that the idea of two-eyed seeing the world out of one eye with an Indigenous lens and looking out of the other eye with a Western science lens, and putting those two together. That's the way to have a healthy appreciation and an ethically healthy appreciation of the environment. And there's no harm in talking to cottagers about ideas like two-eyed seeing. Try to see the world as though you were an Indigenous person. Try to see the world as though you were a rattlesnake. Try to see the world in a different way than the way that your education and your parents and your grandparents brought you up to think, as if you're a settler. And we do have to recognize that there are issues in the way that we look at the culture of the people who were on this land before we were.
Absolutely, thank you. And is there any more on the chat?
Yeah, so I have one comment from David that says the Parry Sound data is typically a provincial summary. And then Tiana says, appreciating what is shared here, a piece that's missing is privilege and entitlement. We have the opportunity to change the narrative and create behavioral change with outreach and storytelling, Indigenous worldview, and Western science coming together and honoring all of creation and the beauty of interconnectedness.
Yeah, absolutely. Right on.
Thank you, Tiana.
It's a picture of Cheryl. I think it might be Cheryl that said that.
Okay.
Yep, that was Cheryl.
Oh, I see. Okay. Are there any questions at this point from those in the room? I've been calling to the chat a lot, but any questions or comments that anyone would like to put out there? All right. Do we have, oh, Hannah? Yeah.
How do you follow up on a presentation, say you've given? Do you guys use certain surveys, or do you have suggestions for like how to get a metric of either behavior change or success for funders and things like that? But like, is there suggestions for how to evaluate whether or not what you've been saying has an impact?
Well, the last school I got a whole envelope of thank you cards. And of course, the teacher was like, you have to put something you learned. And that was interesting because we do a two-part, we do an educational talk, and then we have the classes come to do the hands-on part. And this class showed up and the teacher said, oh, while we were in our class, we did some research. And so we found out that snakes have a nictating membrane. And I was like, No. So when I got these thank you cards from that class, because we really went into it, that they, you know, have a brill or a spectacle, or they don't have any eyelids and whatever. So snakes don't have any eyelids was 80% of the thing they learned in that, because it was just reiterated. Once with scales, with size snake, actually, I guess before scales, but we did get funding to do a study to see what impact our presentation had and the difference that it made that we did a hands-on. So, and it was funded, so the schools didn't have to pay for it. So that gave us a lot of options. And we contacted the schools and said, all you have to do if you want this presentation is you have to give the kids a questionnaire, and they had to answer questions on snakes. And then after our presentation that day, they had to answer the questionnaire about snakes, and then a week later. And it was done in the same format that other studies had been done on retention and how much they could remember about things. And we had that hands-on part, and it blew the other studies away. It was insane, like 80% more retention just because they got to touch it. And we had a pretty good feel about that, because you can get up and stand in front of audience and say snakes aren't slimy 5 times in a 20-minute presentation. And they come up and the first thing, it's not slimy. And it's like, why am I here? But you do need that 2-part. You got to do the education, and when we did the hands-on, it did. But that was specific funding that we got for that. So now when I do a school, when they have me come in and pay for it, I write back and say, did you get any feedback? Anything you want to say? You guys are teachers, you should know. And that's about all I've got at this point.
Carry on, Megan.
Oh, I was just going to say that that's definitely something that I wish that we could do, just to get that little bit of feedback, having people ask or fill out some sort of survey or something at the end of our demonstrations. So we're going to be experimenting with that this summer, and we have a QR code that we're going to put up on the screen afterwards. So hopefully people will scan it and do it and fill out some great to give us a little bit of data, to see if exactly that we're having an impact. I mean, like, you know, you get the applause and you get the tons of questions afterward, and to some degree, like, you know, if people weren't getting it, then they would just, you know, buy everybody at the end of the presentation and they just leave. But more data would be really, really great to have, for sure.
One of the people that some of you there, one of the people who has done some follow-up on a different scale that some of you will know is Jonathan Choquette. And I had the opportunity just yesterday, actually, to attend Jonathan's PhD thesis defense up here at Laurentian, and he is the lead biologist for the Ojibwe Prairie Reptile Recovery Program, which is using, well, I shouldn't try to summarize the project, but is very closely tied to the raising of rattlers in the Toronto Zoo, and part of what he has done, and we didn't have time to talk about it in detail, but we will, is to do knocking on door surveys, and as well as traditional written surveys, I understand, related to the relocation of snakes in the park. And it's now a national park. It was a provincial park in the Ojibwe Prairie Park. And it's very important, if snakes are going to be relocated, baby snakes, if you like, raised in the zoo, relocated to that wildlife area in that park, that those who have the opportunity to hike in the park are made aware of the value of the rattlesnakes in the ecosystem. So it's a project that demands education and an awareness raising on a scale that is very large. And it's a very interesting part of that relocation work that the zoo and WPC are doing. So it points out the importance of understanding your audience, connecting with your audience that Kyle was speaking about, and making sure that you've identified the right audience. But a wonderful piece of work, and his PhD thesis defense, by the way, I can tell you, was wonderfully done. For those of you who know Jonathan, big shout out to Jonathan for the quality of the work that he's done in the presentation yesterday.
Thank you. Yes, a few of us had the privilege of watching that as well, and yeah, a ton of work, and it'll
Yes.
be, I think a lot of us have been waiting a long time to see, to see the snakes return to their natural historic habitat. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So much of what we've heard about today has been about discussions, like verbal conversations with people, presentations. And I'm wondering, like, with social media being such a big influence in the way and the amount of information, the types of information that people are absorbing, do any of you have, tips or things that you've learned that are strategic that could be applied to the social media space? And if not, that is okay. Just wanted to put it out there.
So I can speak a little bit on this because Science North has like many different social media platforms. We do like long formatted films like for YouTube, but then also like a TikTok and Instagram, Facebook, like all these different things. And we typically use the same sort of information across multiple formats and try to get the most bang out of our buck. But it's actually like this, the content that you see that is science related is from us. It's from the science program team. So it's not the marketing team doing the actual content when it comes to science stuff. And so an example of something that sort of happened recently, I was supervising this past weekend, and one of my team members came to me and said, Megan, Tux, our rattlesnake, is shedding. And I said, well, this is great. This is great news. So I immediately made myself comfortable sitting on the very uncomfortable rocks that are beside his habitat, and filmed the whole thing. And I was there probably for about an hour and 20 minutes, sort of perched on these rocks, taking video of him as he's trying desperately to get the underside of his chin sort of loose to get it off, and filmed the whole thing and spoke to our visitors. Every time a visitor went by, I just stopped them and said, this rattlesnake is shedding, and then had a 5 to 10 minute conversation, and then immediately went and made a TikTok with all of that footage that will be then shared cross-platform. And so we really try to, as much as possible, whether it's talking about snakes in general or specific snake or turtle conservation or whatever is like really just like showcasing the really cool things that they do in the adaptations, and like those like quick little snappy pieces of information. And generally speaking, we get really good engagement on our posts when it comes to animal stuff, whether it's a snake or a flying squirrel. We typically get like into the thousands, sometimes tens to hundreds of thousands of like engagement. So like it just, you have to start and then you just have to kind of keep going, because sadly that's the thing about social media, is that you can't just post once a month. You need like the constant feed into the algorithms, I guess. But we've had really great success with it, and I just took that opportunity in that moment and be like, something really cool is happening with the rattlesnake, and it will be shared hopefully soon because it's in the calendar now. So
Awesome. Well, I'll keep an eye out for that one. That sounds really cool. Any other inputs into, and it doesn't have to be social media, like even other sort of avenues that, I don't know, that you found have worked especially well in sharing information and getting people interested?
I think social media is such witchcraft, you know, like there is a whole realm of research into science communication and social media, but because it's so quickly changing, that research is young and constantly out of date. Like the whole field is 15 years old, but it's different every year. So it's just tough. I wish I had the secrets for social media. You know, I'd be way better at it, but certainly the principles still apply in terms of like, and some of them even more so, like you need a hook, you know, you need to grab people's attention span on social media is short, you know, and you need to be able to grab people and you need to personalize it. I think like, you know, as Meghan is talking about the science staff, like really doing their science social media and like connecting with the audience, you know, putting a face on it or making it personal seems to be very good and very useful. But yeah, it's witchcraft, and the algorithms are such that they show you, you know, it's hard to get your message to the people who need it most, because the people who are mostly going to see it are people who think like you. So it's super valuable, and you have to do it, and you got to experiment, and it's the landscape we live in. But man, it's tough. I do love being face to face with people.
Yeah, the construction workers on Highway 69
Yeah,
are
they're
not
not
watching
see
your
it.
TikTok video from Science North. Yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, I just was gonna say that, I mean, here at the Toronto Zoo, a big part of what we do is connecting people, animals, and conservation science to fight extinction. And a big way that we do that is through social media, and we are super lucky to have a strategic communications team that not everybody has, that we then can, you know, lean on for support. And it's not rattlesnakes specifically, but we try to really, especially when things are going out to the bigger Toronto Zoo like platform, we really try to, you know, connect it to things that people can connect to. So we actually just made a post sharing our eastern milk snake monitoring program, but we wanted to do it in a way that, you know, how are people going to be able to connect to it? And each year we find a certain subset of new snakes that we're able to identify through their head markings, and we give them names, and we always share that on social media in order to connect people to that. And this year, with, you know, the whole like Swiftie craziness going on, we decided to give all those snakes like Taylor Swift names, themed names, and especially since she has like a very big connection to snakes with like reputation and all this kind of stuff, we thought it was a really cool way to do it. And we did it like we made a whole big post, all these names. So like number 13 is Taylor and all that kind of stuff for those who are Swifties. And we put it on our platform, but in connection to her new album release. Instead of the Tortured Poets department, it was the Monitored Snakes department, and made a whole thing around it. And it got more engagement than I think we've ever had like a milk snake or snake really post, because we were able to make that connection to something like super real and something that people, you know, are really connected to. And one of our outreach technicians, actually, made a really good point that, you know, and to connect that, like snakes have a bad reputation, which is a Taylor Swift album, but we want to change that. And so, yeah, it was like a big collaborative idea, but it all came together in a really good way, and it got like thousands of views and worked really well. So yeah, just connecting that as much as possible. It's not always easy, but to things that are relevant and people can connect to, just slide that sneaky content in there wherever you can.
Yeah, that's an awesome example. Thank you.
I feel the key to social media is maybe just involve Taylor Swift.
Yeah.
That's wicked though. Or also have young people do your social media. I feel like engage the youth.
Yeah.
What have we got coming in online?
So Matthew has asked, what about communications to audiences that don't really care about their ecological value, tips or approaches?
I think that one of the good ways to start presentations, if you're not in a discovery theater like Franco was and could have kids come and help you pick up a snake, is to speak to the Cottagers Association, or to which will include some of those people, about why it is that you find rattlesnakes fascinating. Why are they fascinating? And try to convey that enthusiasm to your enthusiasm to the audience. I mean, that's what the Blue Coats at Science North do. That's what Meghan and her team do. They convey their enthusiasm and why they find, in Meghan's case, snakes fascinating, but it could be butterflies or it could be the porcupine. Why are they fascinating? people don't know what makes an animal fascinating, what it is about its capacity, like the infrared sensing capacity that a rattlesnake has. You know, it's why are they fascinating? Why am I fascinated by rattlesnakes? Why am I fascinated by whatever it might be, water bugs or something of that sort that tell me what the water quality is? That's what science can convey, is fascination. But Kyle's quite right. You have to avoid the jargon. You have to put it into stories. You have to use all of the sorts of techniques that Kyle spoke about, which was a wonderful overview of science communication. Use the techniques, the strategies that Kyle spoke about. And your purpose is to make an animal, make why you're fascinated aware, make that visible to other people with your enthusiasm. If you don't have enthusiasm, then you can't communicate.
I think it's important too that like it is reminding people that everything is connected, right? And it kind of speaks to that two-eyed seeing piece that Dr. Pearson was talking about. Because if somebody comes up to me and says, well, I don't really care about snakes, well, tell me something that you do care about, and then we can work together to bring it full circle. Well, if you enjoy hunting, okay, or if you enjoy, canoeing, or if you're here at the Science Center, chances are you like something about science. So like where can we meet you, and where can we bring that connectivity back, right? Because everything is connected, whether it's biological or physical, right? There's every aspects of life are connected. So, and it's just kind of, and it takes a little bit of practice, I think. I know that, on my team, we have a lot of, high school students and university students. And part of what we do is training for Blue Coats, right, is learning how to help people connect those things together.
Right.
It's all about sharing our passion 100%. If you come into your job interview and you want to tell me all about how much you love dinosaurs, like we can work with that, right? But it has to start with something, and then we can get you to be like, well, then how do you then bring that passion and talk and share with people about it and bring them into that conversation? So you kind of have to meet both ways, and it does take a little bit of practice, I think.
And the key word there is conversation. One of the places that I was able to visit when we were putting the Ideas for Science North together was the Exploratorium in San Francisco. And Robert Oppenheimer's brother, and we've heard a lot about Robert Oppenheimer recently, Frank Oppenheimer was the director of the Exploratorium. And he had people on the floor talking to visitors that he called explainers. And it was those explainers that were the impetus and the idea for the Blue Coats at Science North. And what was happening on the floor of the Exploratorium were conversations. That's the way to engage with people. And even if you've got an audience of sitting, listening to you, try to turn that audience into to turn the event into a conversation. Ask questions of the audience and have somebody answer, and use that as a trigger, just as Meghan's just spoken about, for engaging them in a conversation, meeting them where they're at, as Kyle spoke about. Making the information relate to the people in your audience. You can penetrate a long way into the perceptions and the beliefs and the fears and the phobias and so forth of a person, if you can engage them in a conversation, and you can begin to do your best to make them see why you find something fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
Or why it relates to them. And that's if they don't have an ecological focus. I had a kid at the home show that his parents had dragged him out, and they say he sits in the basement and plays video games all the time. You'll love snakes.
Yes.
I love to just sit there and do nothing. They're incredibly lazy, and they don't, like that. Oh, you just get along with them just great. It's like nobody's ever done that before about my playing video games in the basement. So we got it interested. And it is amazing if you can always come up with something. to relate. And it was about him, and so then it was interesting, and then he listened.
Perfect.
Challenging creativity sometimes. I think.
Yeah, well, that's it. This kid sits in the basement and plays video games, and that's all he does, so, oh my God, there's not a lot to work with. But you can.
We have a comment from Kenton.
Okay.
People come to Perry Sound area for the beauty and the natural landscape. Rattlesnakes are part of what makes this area special.
That's absolutely right. And if you look at the distribution of rattlesnakes and you get a map of the distribution, they really are. It really is a special area. It really is a special area. There's
Sorry, David, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
no. That was the end of my comment. Special.
We were chatting actually just before this about a particular scenario that we get sometimes where you have somebody come up to you and say, they'll start with something like, I have a rattlesnake on my property and you sense where it's going. And I always try to get in the right way, like, oh, like, you're so lucky. I wish I had one on my property, right? You try to like subvert that conversation a little bit. And I'm still gonna help answer their question about how they can get along with rattlesnakes, because that's the direction it's going. But I want them to know that my immediate reaction is like, that's so cool, like rattlesnakes are amazing. And so, yeah, just trying to really, it is part of what makes an area special, or what makes their, you know, you're so lucky. And somebody mentioned, you know, about privilege and entitlement before, like you're so privileged and so lucky to have a cottage in this beautiful place. And that's part of it. That's part of what makes you lucky, is you get to like see this incredible species. And I try to at least convey that for my own part, even if they don't quite feel it, and hope that it maybe comes across.
Yeah.
Any other questions or even scenarios that maybe you've encountered as you've been doing outreach and practicing different things? And actually, I'm just gonna pause that for a minute. So we keep hearing little bumps in here. Just so that we're all on the same page, it's not birds, it's something with the heating system. I did clarify that with Rick at the break because, well, because it's springtime and we all have snakes, but also birds on mind. But yeah, does anybody have any sort of scenarios that you've maybe encountered that were challenging and that you might want just some input or some shared, you know, pieces on that? Yeah. Nigel.
Hi, it's Nigel here from the zoo. This question is for the folks who deal with hands-on snake demonstrations. I worked for many years in our America's Pavilion as a keeper doing snake demos. And one of the most troubling scenarios I would come up with is that a young child would approach to pet the snake. Young kids typically have very little fear. And it would give the parents an opportunity to do something while the kid was petting the snake to instill fear into the child. Things from blowing on the back of the kid's neck to poking them in the side. And just going back to what Kyle said, that scenario of a traumatic event for a young child being chased by a snake, I felt in that moment that could be a turning point for that kid to be fearful of snakes for the rest of his life. And I never really knew how to react. So wondering if anyone has had similar experiences like that, and if you had any quick responses. How do you deal with that in the moment with a parent who's trying to traumatize their kid, thinks it's funny?
I've had that happen to me as well, and I've just been honest. I just am like, oh no, we don't want to, like, no, don't do that. Like, you know, but you kind of have to be like, you kind of have to say it in like a way that you're not be like, no, don't do that. Because obviously it's not our place necessarily to parent or to reprimand, but be like, oh no, like don't do that, like try it again, but like maybe the person doesn't do that this time, or you know, try touching it again, but no one's going to try to scare you this time, and try and reassure that person, because that, yeah. And I've that's kind of how I dealt with, like, oh no, let's not do that, because we don't want everyone to be scared of the snake, or I think it was a snake that they were trying to touch. So that's kind of how I reacted. And like it went over very well. Like, oh, you're right. You know, like I won't do it again. Go ahead and touch it. And I'm hoping that's only happened to me the one time. I hope that's not a reoccurring thing for you, Nigel. But I just sort of reacted very honestly in that moment, because it's similar to how we were talking earlier about when people are telling us that they kill snakes, is kill rattlesnakes. You're like, wow, like that makes me really sad. It's like appealing to their humanity and their empathy.
Yeah, we just both looked at each other and you said it's only happened to you once. Holy cow. You must have a great crew up there in Sudbury.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's not always a parent. Sometimes it's the kid's friend or somebody else, you know. Yeah, no, I mean, certainly Jenny can speak to it extensively too. And I know for Jenny, you know, when she does the show and you have a captive audience, the #1 rule is no scaring anybody with snakes. And that's like a hard and fast rule. But when you're at where you don't have a captive audience, people rolling through, you can't set that expectation in advance. And yeah, it's tough. And it depends, I think, for me, it's so variable, the context. And if it's sort of lighthearted and playful, you know, it's misguided, but no ill intent was sort of meant. It's amazing what jerks parents can be their own kids. Then I will try to very politely, as you say, Megan, like connect and just sort of explain why, you know, it's not a great thing to do. And like, we're trying to make people see that snakes aren't scary. And, you know, if the parent is being a bit of a jerk, and it does happen, like where they're just fully, it's like you're 12, like why, you know, why is your child in it? So then I talk only to the kid, right? If the parent is being full on rude about it, I will get down, crouch down with the kid and say, you know, that's really tough, isn't it? That's very scary, but it's, you know, the snake's not being scary. And I just try to connect with the kid only. Like there comes a point where I block the parent right out of it. I try to educate the parent, but if they're being, you know, really not taking to that connection, I just want to connect with the kid now.
Yeah.
Because that's, you know.
I just go with the shame.
Yeah. Shame's
No bullying. This is a safe place. And again, you talk to the kid, not everybody understands that, but I'm sure you're old enough to understand. This is a no bullying place where we don't scare people because that would be rude. And you're such a good kid. You would never do that. And talk to the kid, but yeah, I'm not above shame.
my #1 priority in that situation for sure. Because you say like that might be like a key moment for that kid. And so I do want to educate the parent, but I think the same as you. I'm like, this could be the moment that makes this kid afraid of snakes. And I am determined that this kid will not leave here afraid of snakes, even if the parent feels a bit guilty when they leave. And actually, if they feel a bit guilty, all the better. But definitely also your response to that changes whether you're on hour 1 of day 1 or hour 30 of day 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, you got to do your best, but you're right. That's a really tough situation.
Yeah, thanks. It's I never thought of bringing the kid back to immediately correct any fearful behavior they might have. I think that's a really good tool. I'm usually so dumbfounded at the parent. I just want them to go away, but yeah, reconnecting with the child in that moment, I think is really
Never
important.
cease to surprise you. And like some on the very good end and some on the absolutely terrible end.
I saw a question just come in on the chat wondering from each of the panelists, what is the one piece of information or one thing about the Massasauga rattlesnake that you find the most fascinating? So we'll just go if you had to pick one thing. Kyle.
That's so tough. My favorite thing about rattlesnakes is to put it, I guess, yeah, because the way I think of it and the way I would put it to the public is the duality between the way we perceive them and the way they are, which is to say that they're really wimpy. And I love that, right? Like everybody thinks they're this big, scary, terrifying animal. But like when you really understand a rattlesnake, it's just this little wimpy, innocent, dumb creature. And it's beautiful. Like it's just the best thing in the whole world. And I just love that. Personally, I love that. And it's always something that I play on when I talk about them. It's like, you know, you see this thing as big and scary, but it's just a tiny, frightened animal. And it's really dumb. And it doesn't understand what's happening. And that's my favorite thing about them.
Yeah, you basically.
I stole yours.
Lack of, well, I'm gonna word it differently. It's lack of aggression.
Yeah.
Because I often say, because I am the least brave person any of you have ever met in your entire lives, which is
That's
why I
true,
work
I
with
think
snakes.
so.
Yeah. And yeah, these people work at the zoo with these, oh my God, you're so brave.
Terrifying. Like hamsters and stuff.
There's rodents here. Anyway, but yeah, so they're not aggressive. But they can't be mean or nasty or in a bad mood, or they can do scared and not scared. But hey, I'm so good at that. I relate. But they're not aggressive. And that's an amazing thing in the animal world. And rattlesnakes, they're just not aggressive. When I first started working with them, over at the university said, oh, you're gonna get bitten. Because I was so enthused. I was like, but I wasn't, because look at rattlesnake I was really careful. And there's no defensive behavior. Like we were measuring them and doing and okay. And it's like, but I'm a large animal torturing you and you're hardly defensive, let alone aggressive. So that's my thing.
David and Megan, do you each have, yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Yes, no, I actually, one of my favorite things to talk about is their rattle and how cool it is and how it forms and because you have the opportunity to smell myths, right? Because everyone thinks if you count the buttons on the rattle, then that's how old the rattlesnake is. And so any opportunity that I can talk to people about their rattles, and we talk about them obviously in our demonstrations and stuff, and then and that leads like into the fact that, you know, and it builds on what you guys were just saying about the fact that they're not aggressive animals. Like they have this like tiny little thing that buzzes on the end of their tail to tell people how scary and dangerous they are. And other animals, like other snakes, mimic that, like, you know, because it's just such a wild thing to have evolved. And I love, that's like one of my favorite things or favorite adaptations to talk about, like their namesake, rattlesnake. Well, they have this little thing on their tail that buzzes. It's just kind of funny. And we always like when they fall off and then we can play with them.
Yeah, we've got a fake, like a display one here that Hannah's holding up. Hannah, do you want to just like demonstrate?
Never seen a functional fake one before. That's so cool.
It's in the it's frozen. It's in the room.
And David, what about you?
Well, what I find most fascinating is their ability to be able to use infrared to see in the dark. I think that's just an amazing ability. I'd love to know more, and I will do some digging around to try to imagine how that evolved. I think that's just a fantastic capability, absolutely fantastic. And it's not their eyes, it's these infrared sensors that they have that enable them to do that. And to be able to hunt in the dark by detecting the warmth of a mouse, I just find that totally amazing. And that's one of the stories that, or one of the descriptions that the explainers in the exploratorium and the blue coats at Science North would use to raise the fascination level in the person that they're conversing with. Just amazing capacity.
That's why we have a whole exhibit about infrared right in front of the rattlesnake, where you can look at yourself in infrared.
Yeah, imagine you were a snake.
Yeah. Or the snake's looking at you, technically.
That's right. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so the next time we do this, can we go to Science North?
Yeah.
Come on over.
Excellent. All right, we're at about 1:20 and we're thinking of wrapping this up in the next little couple of minutes, but are there any last questions or anything? Yeah, any sort of last sentiments that you want to bring up while we've got both the virtual and the in-person audience here before we start to go into our closing remarks?
Comment from Kenton. I don't have an exact percentage, but it's very rare for a pet to die from a rattlesnake bite. I'll reach out to the vets in town and find out if anyone has a test.
Awesome, that's great. Thank you, Kenton. And if you are able to send that similar to what you did with the hospital information to the SEMRIG email address, we can help to share that with those who are interested.
I doubt that it's like the human stats they really watch carefully,
sure.
but I don't know that the vets would have an organization where they report everything. I do know they get the expired venom, anti-venom from the hospitals for the pets.
Okay.
That's what that vet told me. I have a 12-time bitten dog. But yeah, I don't know whether they'd actually.
But even a good ballpark from some vets in
Yeah.
the sort of Perry Sound area is going to give you
An
a
idea.
sense anyways.
Well, because it's gonna be in that area.
Yeah, while you do that, gather the story of how the anti-venom is made and why it's $2,000 a dose, and why if somebody's really in serious trouble, they're going to need 10 doses. In other words, $20,000 worth of anti-venom, and it doesn't last that long, which is why in the hospital in Sudbury we don't have any here, because there are not enough people who need the treatment for it to be worth the hospital spending that amount of money on something that's probably going to decay before it's ever used. The way that the antivenom is created by, and I don't know the details here, but the antivenom comes from the reaction of a large animal like a horse to being injected. You probably know more about this, Meghan, because you talk about it with the visitors, but needing to use a horse to produce the antivenom, which you then have to extract and to make into a dose that can be used for a human. Meghan, you must know more about that.
I mean, you basically covered sort of what I know about it, that we sort of like the, they give the venom to a large animal, usually a horse, and then collect the serum from the horse and then kind of create the antivenom from there. We had actually, I can't remember, it was like I can't remember his name at the moment. I'm having a total brain fart. But he was from Brazil, and he was from the Butantan Institute, where they develop a lot of these different antivenoms, and for various animals, mostly snakes, scorpions, and spiders that were in Brazil. And he had gone through the process a little bit as well. And it was it's so very interesting for sure. Like I love telling people about that, but then you get a lot of questions will be like, but the horses, and like, they're fine. They're a little sick for a while, but like they live, they're fine.
Hannah?
I'm messaging away to a vet I know as well. And they pulled up a study that I think is for vipers in general, not just Massasaugas, but several studies have reported mortality rates of less than 10% for viper envenomation. And then there's someone in Barrie that gets dogs from cottagers farther north, and for them, it's generally survival rates are pretty high. So
Yeah, and if it's general vipers, I mean, the Massasauga is like the pygmy rattlesnake family. I mean, we're wimpy, but yeah. See?
yeah, well, we'll keep digging, but yeah, this person, I don't know the exact stats, but of the ones we've treated, pretty much all of them survive. So
that is often the stat too with because the human bites in Ontario, both cases, the fatalities, there was no medical attention. So I can honestly tell people, if you got bitten in Ontario and you go see a doctor, you have a 100% chance of survival according to the statistics. So
Like them up.
see?
Okay, we've got a few comments and a question from the online audience.
In response to Hannah, from Joe, thanks Hannah. I think that's just good info to have available to help address people's fear the same way that's for human. Kenton also says 1 unit of antivenom. Oh my goodness. Antivenom is now $750 plus shipping from Mexico. Average treatment is around 16 vials. And Sarah has a question. What key points are impactful to share with the public as to the value of Massasaugas to coexist with us, so controlling rodent population benefits?
I think rodent control it's often the go-to with snakes, and it's a good one. I mean, they are predators of rodents for sure. And if you have a cottage, lice are always a problem in cottages. So rodent control is a great angle, absolutely. And yeah, just keeping in mind that everything has a role, right, in its ecosystem. They exist in an ecosystem with other things, and everything's in balance, and that's important. And I really struggle, people will say like, well, why does this thing matter to me? Why is this important? And it's hard as somebody who's like, well, it just matters because it is. Like, I just love rattlesnakes and they matter. But yeah, I mean, they exist in an ecosystem, and they're in balance in that ecosystem. They control rodents. I think that's as good an angle as any.
Also, if you're hitting Muskoka cottagers, it's not my backyard theory. So what's the difference between an environmentalist and a developer? An environmentalist, well, a developer wants to build a cabin in the woods, and an environmentalist already has a cabin in the woods. So if you're hitting these cottagers and you're like, you have an endangered species on your property, you realize that means they can't develop the other side of the lake. You realize that they can't put in a super highway right behind your cottage. You realize that, you know, they can't put a condominium next door. And, you know, maybe you should keep your snakes. Because theoretically, they're going up there to get away from it all. I mean, most of them take it with them, but they don't really realize that they're up there and they've got this wonderful, valuable property. Well, it'll stay more valuable.
If you can confer that sense of stewardship too, like this is not something you're at conflict with, like this is really cool that this lives on your property and they need our help, and like if you can somehow create that sense of like slightly ownership or stewardship, or like this is something that you can be proud of and you can foster on your property, and some of that comes from trying to build that emotional connection or just get them to see that it's cool, which is easier to say with some people than others, but yeah.
I mean, part of what the zoo might do to sort of turn this in a different direction is to prepare an outline of how a cottage owner could build and insert a hibernarium. In other words, a place where the snake can hibernate through the winter, because that's what kills them. That's the greatest danger. In fact, I think from the zoo there was a year when all of the transferred snakes died in the subsequent winter because they didn't have somewhere to hibernate, somewhere suitable to hibernate. But they're what we saw yesterday from Jonathan was a sketch of. In fact, it was more than a sketch, a photograph of a tubular hibernaculum that can be inserted that a snake would be able to use. In other words, try to contribute to saving the life of the snake, because some of the cottagers you'll talk to will be wanting to keep the snake, not be talking about the snake biting their dog and so forth, but seeing it as an asset to the quality of the land that they're living on. Encourage them to in fact provide a place for the snakes to hibernate. And it's not easy to do. The conditions that Massasaugas hibernate in are very, very particular. But first of all, they got to get through the winter, so it's no good if they freeze to death. But they also, I understand, like to have part of their body in water. The constructing hibernacula would be a wonderful part of a way to get some of these positive cottagers on board, and the fact that they were making those and and constructing them and putting them in the ground, that might inspire the neighborhood, the neighboring cottager to say, boy, if you value your snakes that much, maybe I should try to do the same thing. You know, try to give them a positive role. Try to give them a positive role. Make them realize how fascinating the snakes are, and then give them a positive role in encouraging their survival.
Yeah, and that's good that you brought that up. So I'll just speak for you guys if that's okay. So the Adopt-A-Pond team at the Toronto Zoo does have information on how to create a specifically for snakes a hibernaculum. So perhaps that's something we could share in the post sort of materials. And then also a couple of years ago at this point, Andrew Lantini and Rick Voss made a video about how to safely move a snake if that's needed. So we can include that as well, and those can be tools perhaps that you can keep in your back pockets as well.
Absolutely. And for us, there's some wonderful stuff come up in the chat. Are you able to copy the chat and send it to us?
Yes, we can do that for sure.
That would be great.
All right. Oh, yeah.
No, sorry, I was just gonna build really quick on something that Kyle said about just like almost like challenging people on the aspect of like, well, it doesn't have to, something doesn't need to be important because it's like to affect you, right? It can be important because it is existing, right? And sort of like challenge them on that intrinsic value of nature, right? It's like the snakes are important because they're there, they exist, and sort of starting that conversation. And it may not go anywhere, and they may not understand that, but also it's like not something that I think that you should just ignore either. Be like, well, the snake's important because it exists and it's important for everything to coexist. Yeah.
Right. That's
It's important to remember that we're not the center of everything.
Yes.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. That's two-eyed seeing, you know, that's the circle of life. That's, you know, frankly, changing people's attitudes is part of reconciliation. It's part of reconciliation.
All right, with that, I think we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your insights, your information, your experiences, and your time for driving out here, for joining us virtually. I think, you know, I think it's safe to say that we've all learned at least one new thing today, but I think probably more true to say that we've learned quite a few new things today. And as we go into the spring season, which will soon be the summer season, hopefully we all have opportunities to put some of this into practice. I'd like to thank again the Toronto Zoo for hosting us, for Rick and Nigel for everything that they did to make today go smoothly. To the rest of the community science and outreach working group within SEMRIG, for figuring out the tech and for making this work for the people who could come here, you know, reasonably, and then those who were able to join online. And you know, I didn't want to say anything earlier because I didn't want to jinx it, but as far as hybrid events go, the tech today was like superb. So thank you.
And thanks from everybody to the Toronto Zoo and to Bob Johnson and everything that everybody in this business, including Science North and Franco and those early demonstrations, they were inspired by Bob Johnson. They were inspired by Bob. And the rattlesnakes owe a great deal to the Toronto Zoo, and you should, those of you from the zoo should be patting yourselves on the back for the contribution that you've made to the species, as well as to the communication ways that those of us on that side of the equation have been practicing.
Absolutely. And I'll also just echo that, because, you know, we wouldn't have a rattlesnake at Science North if it wasn't for the Toronto Zoo, because he's technically the Toronto Zoo's rattlesnake that they've loaned to us, and they've been doing that for many, many years. And so thank you.
Yes, for 40 years. 40 years.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks, for your willingness to share your questions and to share your struggles. I recognize that puts you in a position of vulnerability, admitting something that maybe didn't go perfectly or that you're afraid to admit or whatever it might be. And I think something that's really been highlighted for me just in the past 1 minute is the value of working together to overcome these challenges, that they are shared, and that together we have the tools and the resources to go around and to strengthen what each other are doing, because ultimately we're all working towards the same goal. So thank you, everyone, and goodbye to our online audience.
And goodbye. Goodbye.